Good morning, everyone. We are going to be working on Chapter 11 today from A Child's History of the World. Chapter 11 is titled A Fairy Tale War. The history of countries usually begins, and also ends, with war. The first great happening in the history of Greece was a war. It was called the Trojan War, and was supposed to have taken place about 1,200 years before Christ, or not long after the beginning of the Iron Age. But we are not only unsure of the date, we are simply not even sure how much of the story is true. A great deal of it, we know, is simply fairy tale. This is the way fairy tales go. Once there was a wedding feast of the gods and goddesses on Mount Olympus, when suddenly a goddess who had not been invited threw a golden apple on the table. On the apple were written these words, "To the fairest." Now, fairest at that point is beautiful, not somebody who's overly fair and is trying to provide things to be equal all the time. Fairest is the most beautiful. The goddess who had thrown the apple was the goddess of quarreling. And true to her name, she did start a quarrel. For each of the goddesses, like vain human beings, thought she was the fairest and should have the apple. At last they called in a shepherd boy named Paris to decide who was the fairest. Paris is the fairest, not really. Each goddess offered Paris a present if he would choose her. The queen of the gods, Hera, offered to make him a king. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, offered to make him wise. But Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, offered to give him the most beautiful girl in the world for his wife. Now Paris was not really a shepherd boy, but the son of Priam, the king of Troy, which was a city on the seashore opposite Greece. When he was a baby, Paris had been left on a mountain to die. But he had been found by a shepherd and was brought up by him as his own child. Paris didn't care about being wise. He didn't care about being king. What he did want was to have the most beautiful woman in the world for his wife. And so he gave the apple to Aphrodite. Now, the most beautiful woman in the world was named Helen, and she was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. In spite of that fact, Aphrodite told Paris to go to Sparta in Greece, where he would find Helen and then run away with her. So Paris went to Sparta to visit King Menelaus and was royally entertained by him. And then Paris, although he had been treated so kindly and had been trusted, one night stole Helen away and carried her off across the sea to Troy. Menelaus and the Greeks were naturally very angry and immediately prepared for war and sailed off for Troy to get Helen back. Now, in ancient times, all cities had walls built around them to protect them from their enemies. As there were no cannons, nor guns, nor deadly weapons such as are used in war nowadays, it was very hard to get into a walled city or capture it. Troy was protected in this way by walls, and though the Greeks tried for 10 years to capture it, at the end of the 10 years, Troy was still unconquered. At last, the Greeks decided to try a trick to get into the city. They built a huge horse of wood, and inside this wooden horse, they put soldiers. They placed the horse in front of the city wall and then sailed away as if at last they were giving up the war. The Trojans were told by a spy that the horse was a gift of the gods and that they ought to take it into the city. A Trojan priest named Laocoon, however, told his people not to have anything to do with the horse, for he suspected a trick. But people seldom take advice when told not to do something they want to do. Just then, some huge snakes came out of the sea and attacked Laocoon and his 2 sons, and twining around them, strangled them to death. The Trojans thought this was a sign from the gods, or an omen, as they would have said, that they should not believe Laocoon. So they determined to take the horse into the city against his advice. Adelaide, can we please work on school? Put that away. You can work on that later, but I need you to work on school, please. When night fell, the Greek soldiers came out of the horse and opened the gates of the city. The other Greeks, who had been waiting just out of sight, returned and entered through the gates and the hole the Trojans had made in the wall. Lost my place. Blah, 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 blah. Troy was easily conquered then, and the city was burned to the ground, and Helen's husband carried her back to Greece. Because of this horse trick, we still have a saying, beware of Greeks bearing gifts, which is as much to say, look out for an enemy who brings you presents. The story of the Trojan War was told in 2 long poems. Some people think they are the finest poems that were ever written. One of these poems is called the Iliad, from the name of the city of Troy, which was known as Ilium. The Iliad describes the Trojan War itself. The other poem is called the Odyssey, and describes the adventures of one of the Greek heroes on his way home after the war was over. The Greek hero's name was Odysseus, which gives the name Odyssey to the book. But he was also called Ulysses. These poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were composed by a Greek poet named Homer, who is supposed to have lived at some time before 700 BC. Homer may have been a bard, that is, a singing poet who went about from place to place and sang his songs to the people. He probably collected old legends and made his poems from them. Usually a bard played on a lyre as he sang, and the people gave him something to eat or a place to sleep to pay for his songs. People enjoyed hearing Homer's songs. They learned them by heart, and mothers taught them to their children after Homer had died. The poems were written down in Greek, and you may someday read them in Greek, if you study the language, or at least in an English translation. I have told you that Homer probably made his songs out of old legends. There were many legends, too, about Homer himself, and we don't know which are true. He was said to have been blind. 7 different cities each proclaim that Homer had been born in their city, so you can count 6 or 7 legends right there. All right, kiddos, that is it for chapter 11. We will be coming back probably next week to read chapter 12. Have a lovely rest of the week. Ta-ta for now.